Gold digger. My mom stole all my college funds for her fourth wedding, so I exposed her and got her arrested by wearing a custom t-shirt. I lost my grandmother when I was 18. She was a strong, no-nonsense woman who ran her own interior decorating business for 50 years and raised 3 kids. My mom was the middle child, and we had constant conflicts when I was a kid. I often saw my grandmother and mother arguing over trivial things and wondered why, until I realized that my grandmother hated my mother because of me. According to my aunt, my parents never wanted me and resented me from the moment I was born. I lived with my grandmother for the first 6 months of my life. However, when I started to grow up, my grandmother forced my parents to take responsibility. I remember being called many derogatory names as a child, especially by my father. If I made the slightest mistake, he would call me names like idiot or little idiot elephant, which really hurt. Interestingly, despite these labels, I happened to be the most academically capable of my cousins, thanks to the encouragement I received from my parents as a child. I was keen to pursue a science degree, but my parents would hit me for seemingly trivial reasons, such as painting my nails or talking to boys. My father never let me wear makeup and disapproved of me wearing tights, even if it was just yoga pants with a long shirt, and anything that was associated with girls, my father disapproved of. Please remember that I was still growing up and his control had a big impact on me. When my parents fought a lot, it always seemed to be my fault. On top of that, my mother constantly complained that I didn't help around the house. In fact, I was told to help from an early age. I folded the laundry at least twice a day, cleaned 1 bathroom a day, washed the dishes, and took care of various other chores, such as sweeping the floor. Despite all this, I never complained, but my parents never showed any appreciation. At that time, I felt like an underappreciated person. At home, I always did most of the things my parents asked me to do and avoided doing the things they didn't mention. I didn't drink alcohol, stayed away from drugs, and made sure I didn't wear clothes they considered revealing. Unfortunately, I wasn't even allowed to go out with friends for my birthday or have them over. Sometimes I made up excuses to stay at school a bit longer during the day because I like spending time with people outside of my family. However, everything changed when my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. As much as I hated the fact that my father was always trying to control my life, I still didn't want him to die, but my mother obviously did, and she left my dad saying she didn't want to be burdened by a sick husband. My dad and I were both stunned when we saw her packing her bags and leaving. Later, my dad sat on the porch and broke down, and even though I was only 14 years old, I could understand his pain. I always saw him sitting on the porch drinking beer when he was upset, so when I heard him crying, I got him a beer from the fridge. Dad started getting angry when he realized I was handing him the beer. He understood that I was trying to comfort him in the only way I knew how. From that day on, I don't know how or why, but everything changed between my dad and me. He stopped being rude or abusive to me. I would even say he was a good father. Within a few weeks of my mother leaving, my parents got divorced, which was easy because my dad had a prenuptial agreement with her and she couldn't get any alimony the next month. My mom had already moved in with her new boyfriend, Morty, who was apparently her high school sweetheart. During this time, my mom hated having me on the weekends and would make up excuses whenever my dad drove me home, saying she couldn't see me on the weekends. This really upset me because it felt like my mother had divorced me along with my father. During this time, my grandmother continued to visit me, and I loved spending time with her. She would call me and my cousins every month and invite us to spend the night at her house, which is still one of my fondest memories. 5 months after my parents divorced, my mother, of course, got married again. Morty, her high school sweetheart, had bought my mother a house in the hope that they could start a family together. However, my mother had other plans. I rarely visited her, and every time I did, I would find her giggling on the phone, and she would only hang up because Morty was coming home. Apparently, Morty eventually found out that she had been cheating on him with another man, and they had a big fight, but my mother managed to convince him that it was a one-time mistake, so they stayed together for the time being. My father's health did not improve, and the cancer took over his last few days. He wanted to spend as much time with me as possible. When I came home from school, I was afraid that something might have happened to him. Unfortunately, one night, after several months of ineffective chemotherapy, my father died in his sleep. When my mother came over, I couldn't stop crying. She was alone and couldn't see Morty anywhere. I didn't know it at the time, but my mother had been carrying on a conversation with Morty and the others on her shoulder, and he had finally left. At my father's funeral, my mother kept saying that my father's death couldn't have been worse, because she had already dealt with so many things. When my father's will was left, everyone was shocked and annoyed by her indifference. The will announced that all his property would immediately be mine. My mother seemed to be very eager to return to my life, but my grandmother didn't want me to live with my mother, because she knew that she had raised the daughter she had raised, and she knew that my mother wanted my money, which my father had left to me. She and my aunt helped me sell all my father's assets so that they could open a university trust fund in my name. However, because I was still a minor, my mother's name also had to be added. Meanwhile, my mother's husband Morty divorced her in the meantime, and since they had no assets, she ended up with a substantial settlement. That's why Grandma warned her not to touch my funds, emphasizing that she already had her own money. When my mother and I started living together, at first I felt as if I were living with a stranger. Over the years, she has changed so much, and not in a good way. She always acts like a teenager. Every night she goes out dressed up, and late at night she brings strange men home, whom she brings to her bedroom the next morning. Walking into the kitchen, I find strangers in the house. When I was 16, my mother introduced me to her third husband, Joe. From the beginning, I knew he didn't like me. He was mean to me and unnecessarily critical. Whenever I brought this up with my mother, she confronted him, which made the hostility more covert and behind the back. 10 months later, my brother was born, and my mother's narrative changed, with Joe being portrayed as a kind person at heart, but apparently having difficulty expressing himself. My mother encouraged me not to resent him, but to be more understanding. However, Joe lavished his love on my brother, Brad. Strangely, my mother confided in me several times that she and Joe had nothing in common, but she married him anyway because he could provide us with a stable home. This was completely untrue, as my mother and Joe fought constantly, especially after Brad was born. Joe wanted my mother to stay away from me, and he would yell at her if she came near Brad. He would tell me that he wished I had died with my father or that I had gone to live with my grandmother, because he wanted all the love and attention for his son. Living with him was painful and mentally exhausting, and I was obviously not welcome. Every time I would beg or question my mother about why she was with him, she would tactfully change the subject. One day, my mother and Joe left us to hang out with their friends, at first once or twice a month, and then almost every weekend. They would usually leave me at home with Brad, but that night I had to study for an exam, so they dropped us both off at my grandmother's house. I like being with her. She usually cooks really good food for me, and I can study in peace while Brad lies on the living room floor playing with his toys. Grandma had sternly told my parents that they should come back to pick us up before 11 o'clock, and yet they still hadn't returned even after 11 o'clock at night. I started to worry because I had an exam the next day, and I also had to put Brad to bed on time, otherwise Joe would yell at me. Meanwhile, Grandma kept calling and left 3 angry voice messages for my parents at 12 a.m. Joe and my mom finally showed up in the car, drunk and giggling like drunk teenagers, not knowing what they were doing. We were shocked that they were able to drive here without being noticed. Joe went to get Brad, and my mom told me to pack my bags, and then we drove back. However, my grandmother adamantly disagreed. She yelled at them for showing up so late and being so drunk, which was dangerous for all of us. She told Joe that she couldn't let him bring his son home in that state, and that we should call an Uber and leave the car at her place. However, Joe started arguing with her. Coming so late and drunk is dangerous for all of us. She told Joe that she couldn't let him bring his son home like that, and that we should call an Uber and leave the car with her. However, Joe started arguing with my grandmother, telling her to mind her own business and saying that he was the father and therefore knew what was best for his son. Tensions quickly escalated, and there was a heated exchange of insults between my grandmother and Joe. My mother stood by, saying nothing. Clearly drunk and unable to handle things, I could feel the tension rising, so I begged them to stop arguing, reminding them that it would scare my brother, but my words fell on deaf ears. The argument continued, and Joe started insulting my grandmother and me, saying that he had never liked us, but tolerated us for my mother's sake. This made my grandmother even angrier, and she angrily threatened to call the police. Hearing this, Joe, who was clearly drunk, yelled like a madman. He did the worst thing I have ever seen him do, and he slapped my grandmother. When Joe's hand hit my grandmother's face, I screamed in horror, and my voice echoed through the room. "Stop, just stop," I yelled, but Joe didn't even look at me. Brad started crying, and it was obvious that my grandmother was very traumatized. She pulled my cheeks and told me to call the police, while my mother watched the whole thing in horror. I don't even remember what I told the 911 operator, because I was crying so hard, but luckily the operator understood what I said and kept me on the line until the police arrived. Joe noticed the sirens approaching, and his face showed signs of panic. He began pleading with my grandmother, his eyes filled with despair, begging her not to press charges, insisting that it would ruin his life and my mother's. In the end, Joe was charged with assault and taken away in handcuffs. He kept pleading with my mom to bail him out, but my mom, who had previously stood by and watched, started crying and yelling at him. My grandmother told my mom in no uncertain terms that if she didn't divorce the man, she would involve Child Protective Services and she would lose both children. My mom just nodded, clearly terrified. I later learned that Joe and my mom had also been high on drugs and drunk that night. The reason she escaped without rest was because she, unlike Joe, basically kept quiet. That night, Brad and I stayed at my grandmother's house because I refused to be alone with her, because I was so disappointed and traumatized. Fortunately, the next day, when my mother came to her senses, she realized what her husband had done. She filed for divorce and forbade him from seeing us again. When the rest of the family found out what Joe had done, they all turned on my mother, as was only natural. Everyone asked questions, as was only natural. Why had it taken my mother so long to take action, and why had she not seen the signs earlier? My uncles and aunts shouted at my mother until she started to cry. They were so angry that they swore they would never speak to her again. As for her husband's actions, the court sentenced him to probation, based on Joe's allegations, and because he was a first offender. Joe had to attend counseling and was ordered to stay away from us. He was only allowed to see my mother with her permission and in her presence. He did try to ask my mother for forgiveness, but she wouldn't listen and divorced him, the manipulative jerk. She got a lot out of the divorce settlement and has been living well ever since. After Joe's incident, I didn't want to live with my mother, so I moved all my things to my grandmother's house, and Brad stayed with my mother. My mother didn't like this arrangement, because she depends on me to look after my younger brother, but she didn't dare say anything to me, because she was afraid that my grandmother would scold her for it. This year I celebrated my 18th birthday and was really excited to finally be an adult and start a new phase in my life. However, life had other plans, and my grandmother died a week after my birthday. She had a heart attack, which came as a complete surprise to me, as she had not had any heart problems before her death. At the funeral, which was attended by the whole family, a will had already been drawn up, distributing her assets between my mother and aunts. She had left the family heirlooms and jewelry equally to her sons, some of which were very expensive for her eldest son. She had left her car to her uncle, who had always been her favorite. She divided her money among her cousins as part of their college trust funds. She left the most important things in her house, apparently because I was the closest of all the children to my grandmother and had always lived with her. She didn't want me to go back to my mother. I was shocked and started to cry for joy because her house meant so many good memories to me. Unfortunately, my grandmother left Brad nothing. I don't know if she forgot or if it was because Brad is only my half-brother. Needless to say, my mother was furious with my grandmother for her actions. She bluntly said that giving me the house was more valuable than giving her jewelry. It was so unfair that her mother left me so much, and no one else complained except my mother, because they all knew that what my grandmother left us was what we deserved. My mother was so angry because Brad got nothing, and she started saying bad things about my grandmother, saying that she was a selfish woman who didn't do anything for her son. I got angry and told her that she should be grateful that her mother had decided to leave her anything after the way her ex-husband had treated her. Hearing this, my mother angrily said that I had no right to bring up the past, which made me laugh at her, and then she started telling me how I should sell my grandmother's house and move in with her. I told her that I really liked living in the house and would never sell it because it meant more to me than money. My mother did try to push me more, but I stuck to my guns. I told her that living on my own was fantastic. I was always surrounded by toxic people until I moved in permanently with my grandmother. I have never lived on my own, but I have been spending a lot of time with myself and getting therapy to deal with my grandmother's death and everything that has happened in my life. I decided to take a year off from school because I am no longer a minor. I wanted to withdraw from my trust fund for my mother. I needed her signature to access the money and also to remove her from the list of beneficiaries, so I went to talk to my mother 2 months ago. She introduced me to her new boyfriend, Robin, who she had been seeing for a few weeks. Robin seemed like a nice guy, but a lot younger than her, unlike her previous ex-husbands. However, I knew better than to mention his age, so I asked my mother to talk to him in private, and she agreed. I thought things would be fine regarding the trust fund, as it was entirely my father's money, but when I told my mother that I wanted to be removed from the trust, she started to freak out. I found this strange and told her that this was my plan all along and that I was 18 and wanted to manage my finances myself. She refused, saying that I was too young and that I wouldn't be going to college this year anyway, so there was no need to remove my name. Her behavior started to make me suspicious, but my mother insisted that I could always come to her when I went to college. Later, I stayed with Brad for a while and then left. When I was driving home, I realized that it was possible that my mother had used my funds, although at the time it seemed a bit far-fetched. I decided to consult a lawyer to help me understand the terms and conditions of the trust document. After reviewing it, the lawyer agreed that my mother needed to sign before I could access the money, but that I could check its current value if I wanted. This is how I discovered what my mother had been doing from the bank. Not only had she been withdrawing small amounts from the trust fund over the years, but after our recent conversation, she had withdrawn all the money in the account. I was shocked. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under my feet. The blow of the betrayal was heavy, and it left me in a state of betrayal and disbelief. I was so angry at my mother's actions that I spent the next few days crying and moping around the house, unable to understand why she had done it. There was no doubt in my mind that she didn't want me to cancel her access to my funds. I knew that if I confronted her, she would just deny it or come up with some lame excuse. I felt that I needed to teach her a lesson, and luckily, my mom didn't know that I knew she was stabbing me in the back. She called to tell me that she was getting married again, and she talked excitedly about how Robin was definitely the one for her, which almost made me roll my eyes, because that's what she always said every time she told me which man she was marrying. That she would celebrate her love with Robin in a grand wedding. I just wanted to scream at her and accuse her of being a rubbish parent who stole my money, but I kept my mouth shut because I wanted to get back at her for having a wedding, which gave me the perfect opportunity to make plans. I decided to call a family meeting, gather all the cousins and trusted relatives, tell them what I was going to do, and show documents showing how my mother had withdrawn money from my university trust fund, money my father had left me, and when she realized she could no longer access it, she withdrew it all. She could no longer access the money because I had told them about the extent of her betrayal. When I first learned the truth, the shocked and disbelieving expressions on my family's faces were exactly the same as mine. I told them that she had married at the wrong time and that she had probably withdrawn too much money for a lavish wedding. I wanted to humiliate her at the event and then arrest her. My aunt and uncle were shocked that my mother could be so despicable. They assured me of their support, and my cousins agreed with my plan. My mother's wedding took place last week. She invited the whole family to her church wedding and the big reception. Together with Robin, I decided to go to the wedding wearing a t-shirt with the words, "My mother is a gold-digging woman," printed on it. To the wedding. The shirt was custom-made for the occasion. Robin and his family looked shocked when they saw me dressed like this, but I just smiled politely and went to my seat. My family on my side already knew about my plan, so they were ready when my mother started walking down the aisle, ignoring my plan. I remained seated and she didn't even look at me as she walked past. So my plan seemed to have worked at the wedding. When the priest asked if anyone had any objections to the couple being joined, I knew this was my moment. I raised my hand in objection. The priest looked surprised, however, as did my aunt, uncle, and cousins, in addition to me. My mother and Robin looked at us in horror as I stood up from my seat, and my mother finally saw the words on my t-shirt and blushed in shame in front of all the guests. I accused my mother publicly of stealing money from my college trust fund and produced documents to reveal the details of her betrayal, emphasizing that she had stolen my hard-earned money and left me without money for college. Her face turned pale as whispers spread among the guests. Then I loudly asked her why she had stolen money from her own daughter, who had been married 3 times and had received more than enough alimony from her previous 2 marriages. When Robin turned to my mother, the room was filled with gasps, and he obviously didn't know about her actions. He asked her what I meant by 3 marriages, and she told him only about 1. My mother glared at me angrily and started yelling at me, saying how childish I was, that my mother hadn't stolen any of my money because she was entitled to it because she had married my father, and that I should be thanking her for giving birth to me. I yelled at her that what she had done was illegal and that I would make sure she was arrested. However, my mother laughed at me, saying how ungrateful I was, insisting that it was no big deal because she had practically raised me and that I should at least let her have the money she felt entitled to as my mother. That's when Robin chimed in, asking my mother if that was why they were able to afford such an extravagant wedding, since my mother had covered all the costs. My mother remained silent, which was basically an admission. At that point, the situation completely spiraled out of control. I couldn't hold back my anger and started shouting at her. The chaos escalated and my relatives joined in, expressing their anger at my mother's despicable behavior. Amidst the shouting, my relatives joined in, expressing their anger at me. A police report was filed, after which my mother was charged with embezzlement and financial fraud. I can't believe it, even as I write this, because I never thought my mother would be arrested. I can't believe she would do this to me after the wedding. I received calls from everyone concerned and indignant. Some of my distant relatives think I've gone too far, that I shouldn't have involved other people or gotten my mother arrested. My family thinks I've done the right thing, but this is such an extraordinary situation that I have to ask myself if I've gone too far. My Mother Ida update. Thanks to everyone for the kind words. When I posted this message, I was thinking too much and felt very guilty, because I have never really hated my mother, at least not before she threw me out of the house. I never wanted to sue her, and it still feels like a nightmare, but I understand that it is all her own doing. To all those who are worried about me, please don't be, because my uncle has already found me a brilliant lawyer who is convinced that we will win the lawsuit against my mother. My only goal is to get back the money I lost, or at least as much as possible. For anyone who wants to know how Brad is doing, he is fine. He is still too young to understand that he is currently living with Joe's family because my mother was arrested. Update. It's been 6 months since my last update. I know many of you want to know what happened, and I want to clarify that I'm not allowed to talk or write about the case while the legal proceedings are ongoing. In short, the court ruled in my favor, and my mother was ordered to pay back every penny she stole from me. She cried and begged me to take the money, but the judge wasn't moved. Now she has to sell all her assets and probably her house to pay me back. It feels good to write this, because I have had a really hard time in recent months. My mental health is the only thing that keeps me going. My grandmother would be proud of me for standing up to my mother, and my father would want me to invest his money in my future. Update 3 months have passed since my last update. How did everyone's new year go? Mine was great. My mother faced the consequences of her actions and repaid the full amount she had embezzled from my university trust fund. Legal proceedings forced her to make at least financial amends. I also made the difficult decision to sever my relationship with my mother permanently. My other family members agreed with this view, and together we decided to distance ourselves from her, despite her attempts to contact us and hope that we could forgive and forget this recent incident. Recently, I have been going through brochures and thinking about my next steps in 2024. Despite the legal proceedings, the gap year has been amazing overall. I have spent the time working on self-discovery and recovering from past traumas. Spending time with my cousins and other family members has been a great motivator.